It is the winter of 1821. Snow flurries all around as people make their way home on the island of Manhattan. The New York of the early 19th century is a hard, dangerous place where the rules of the street are the rules of the city that clings to the east coast of America. A child is born into this world of smoke, steel and survival. The boy who would become feared by all who knew him and, God forbid, crossed him. He took his first breath in a city that was growing, swelling, choking on its own ambition. The 5 Points district, a filthy, crowded underbelly of Manhattan, was teeming with immigrants, mostly Irish, pushing their way into a country that barely wanted them. But William Poole wasn't born into their struggle. No, his roots were in an older, angrier America. His father, a butcher by trade, was a proud, red-blooded American with English lineage, a man who believed in muscle over manners, in fists over fairness. The elder Poole ran a butcher shop in Manhattan, carving meat by day, carving out his son's future by night. He had no patience for weakness, no tolerance for softness. He moulded his boy at the butcher's block by day and at the punch bag at night. A young, impressionable William learned quickly. By the time he was 10 years old, his hands knew the weight of a cleaver, the feeling of raw flesh beneath his fingers, the discipline of a trade that required strength, precision, and a stomach for violence. But the butcher's shop wasn't just about meat, it was about power, and William Poole was hungry for it. As the years passed, Poole grew into a brawler, a street fighter, a boy with fire in his fists. By his teenage years, he towered over others his age, broad-shouldered, thick-necked, a human wrecking ball wrapped in butchers' aprons. He didn't just fight, he relished it. And in 1830s New York, there was always a fight to be had. The 5 Points was a battlefield, a place where gangs ruled the streets and political factions used fists to settle debates. The Irish immigrants, pouring in by the thousands, were forming their own power. The Dead Rabbits, the O'Connell Guards, the Roach Guards. And standing against them, the men who called themselves native-born Americans, those who believed they had the right to the city, the Bowery Boys, the true blue Americans, the Atlantic Guards. William Poole, barely out of childhood, took up their banner. The Bowery Boys, a gang of working-class native New Yorkers, saw in him more than just a fighter. They saw a warrior. By the time he was in his late teens, he was more than just a butcher's son. He was a butcher of men, a gang leader, a man who believed New York belonged to the Americans who built it, not the immigrants flooding its streets. The blood on his hands wasn't just from cattle and swine anymore. They more often than not were smeared with the claret of a man whose stomach had just welcomed the cold steel of William's cleaver. William Poole's youth was fists forged in steel in the unshakable belief that the streets of New York were his for the taking. The butcher's son was no longer just a boy. He was Bill the Butcher, and his war was only just beginning. The streets of 5 Points were a pressure cooker of violence, ready to explode. The 1830s saw wave after wave of Irish immigrants pouring into New York, fleeing famine and poverty back home. They arrived desperate, starving, willing to do anything to survive. But to the nativist American-born street gangs, these newcomers were a disease, dirty, Catholic, unworthy of American soil. At the head of this anti-immigrant force stood the Bowery Boys, a gang of tough, brawling men who saw themselves as the rightful rulers of New York's streets. They wore red firemen's shirts, greased their hair, and patrolled their turf with the swagger of men who knew they owned it. And William Poole was one of their most fearsome leaders. Poole wasn't just a gang leader, he was a butcher who used his trade on the street, a man who knew how to carve through flesh and bone. In fights, he didn't just punch, he hacked, tore, and ripped men apart with the same precision he used in his shop. To the Irish gangs, he was a monster in human form. On the other side, the Dead Rabbits were just as brutal, just as organised, just as determined to hold their ground. They were Irish immigrants who had fought for everything they had, and they weren't about to let the Bowery Boys push them out. For months, the two gangs had been clashing in small skirmishes, brawls outside taverns, knife fights in alleyways. But it wasn't enough. The hatred ran too deep, and in the sweltering heat of summer, it all came to a head. It started with a single insult. A dead rabbit, drunk and angry, stumbled out of a tavern near Paradise Square and found himself face to face with a group of Bowery Boys. An off-colour comment, perhaps, a shove, a punch, and then chaos. The fight exploded instantly. Fists and boots smashed into the ribs and faces. One man hit the ground, his skull cracking against the cobblestones. A second later, knives were drawn. Within minutes, the streets were swarming. More dead rabbits poured into the square, wielding clubs, bricks and pistols. The Bowery Boys answered in kind, dragging men from nearby saloons, armed with blackjacks, crowbars and whatever they could grab. Then William Poole arrived. He didn't waste time. He didn't bark orders. He waded into the fight like a man possessed. His butcher's cleaver, stained with the morning's work, became a weapon of war. A dead rabbit rushed him, a knife in hand. Poole caught his wrist, twisted it hard until the bone snapped, then drove his cleaver into the man's shoulder. The blade sank deep, ripping through flesh, splitting muscle. The man screamed, blood spurting as he collapsed onto the street. Poole turned. Another rabbit lunged. This time Poole grabbed a meat hook from his belt, a long, curved piece of iron, sharp as a wolf's tooth. He rammed it into the man's ribs, hooked it under the bone, and yanked. The man howled as his body twisted unnaturally, his own ribs tearing apart as he hit the ground, twitching in agony. And still the fight raged on. Another man rushed at him, fists raised. Poole spun, his cleaver coming down in a savage arc, crashing into the side of the man's head. The cleaver sank deep into the skull. A thud that reverberated through the street as the man fell limp. For a moment the world went silent, the moon reflecting off the cleaver's blade like some twisted gleam of justice. Poole stood over him, face covered in sweat and blood, his breath heavy in his chest. He didn't have time to think. Another man was coming. This time Poole took out the sharp, curved butcher's knife, the blade perfect for cutting through sinew and tendon. He swung it with eerie precision, slicing across the man's chest. The knife ripped through the thin fabric of his shirt, cutting deep into his flesh, the blood pouring out in an instant, soaking his shirt and pooling in the gutters. The man staggered back, hands clutching his wound. Poole, with a grim smile, stepped forward and slashed across the man's throat with the same brutal efficiency he used to butcher livestock. The blade met skin, and the sound of tearing flesh echoed through the square. The man collapsed, his breath a desperate, gurgling choke as he crumpled to the ground in a heap. Poole didn't blink. He moved forward. By now, the entire square was a battlefield. The cobblestones ran slick with blood, reflecting the gaslight glow of nearby lampposts. Men lay dead and dying, their moans lost beneath the roars of battle. A Bowery boy, face caked in blood, smashed a club into an Irishman's skull with a sickening crack. Another dead rabbit dragged a man to the ground and stabbed him again and again until his knife hit the pavement. Gunshots rang out. A pistol ball caught a Bowery boy in the chest, spinning him backward into a doorway where he coughed blood onto the bricks before sliding down, dead where he sat. William Poole? He was still fighting, his hands drenched in blood, his cleaver hacking through the chaos. He had taken a knife wound to the leg, but he didn't stop. He fought until the very last moment, until the police whistles blew through the night and the sound of heavy boots came rushing in. The fight lasted nearly an hour, but in that time the damage had been done. 8 dead rabbits and 5 Bowery boys lay dead as the sun arrived early on that summer's morning. Their bodies were stripped of weapons and dragged away for burial. Dozens lay wounded, stabbed, shot and beaten beyond recognition. The police did almost nothing. Oh, They arrested a few men. They made a show of dragging away the worst offenders. But they knew the truth. The 5 points belonged to the gangs. And by the next night, the blood had been washed away, the bodies buried, and the war between the Bowery Boys and the Dead Rabbits continued. As for William Poole, he walked away a legend. He was the butcher of Paradise Square. He was the man who turned a street fight into a slaughterhouse. And he wasn't done yet. By the late 1840s, New York had become a city split in two. On one side stood the Irish immigrants, growing in numbers, forming their own power bases, flooding the workforce with cheap labour. On the other side stood the nativist gangs, men who saw the Irish as parasites, stealing jobs, changing the culture, polluting the city. At this time, William Poole had become the face of the resistance. The Bowery Boys weren't just a street gang anymore. They had political backing, ties to the Know Nothing movement, a hardline anti-immigrant faction that was growing in power. Poole wasn't just fighting for the streets anymore, he was fighting for control, and the Irish knew it. The Dead Rabbits, the Irish gang that had nearly been wiped out in the Paradise Square massacre, had returned with a vengeance. They weren't just thugs anymore, they had an army, and they were looking for payback. It should have been a simple night at the Astor Place Opera House. A play, Macbeth, starring the English actor William Charles Macready. A normal evening for the city's elite. But outside, it was a powder keg waiting to explode. The Irish working class hated Macready, an Englishman who had once mocked the Irish, calling them unrefined, uncivilized. To them, he was a symbol of everything they despised, the old world's arrogance, the oppression they had fled from. And so they gathered by the thousands, dead rabbits, Irish labourers, radicals, swarming the streets outside the theatre. But the nativists, they weren't about to let the Irish control the city. By nightfall, the Bowery Boys had arrived, led by none other than William Poole himself. They marched in like soldiers, red firemen's shirts, black boots, fists clenched, determined to break the Irish rebellion before it began. Then the first brick is thrown, then another. Then the gunshots started. The riot erupted into full-scale warfare. Windows shattered, bodies slammed against brick walls. The air was thick with smoke and screams. William Poole, he moved like a storm, his boots hammering the pavement. The Dead Rabbits don't hesitate. They surge forward, a wall of muscle and fury. A dead rabbit with a rusted crowbar swings at Poole's head. Poole ducks at the last second, grabbing the man by the throat. With a roar, he slams him backward against a lamppost, ribs cracking like dry twigs. The rabbit gurgles, blood spilling from his lips, but before Poole can finish the job, another attacker rushes him. This time, the rabbit lands a blow, a brutal one. A wooden club crashes into the side of Poole's knee, sending a sickening crack through the air. Poole staggers, his leg nearly buckling. The rabbit grins, sensing weakness. Poole lunges forward, grabbing the man by the hair. He smashes his forehead into the rabbit's nose, sending a spray of blood across the street. The man collapses to his knees, hands clutching the ruin of his face. Poole doesn't give him a chance to recover. He grabs him by the jaw and wrenches his head sideways until there's a sharp, wet snap. But the rabbits aren't going down easy. On the far side of the square, a group of Bowery Boys are getting overwhelmed. A gang of Irishmen swarms them, fists flying, knives flashing. One nativist takes a blade to the gut, stumbling backward as his intestines spill onto the cobblestones. Another gets his head split open by a hurley stick, the Irish war club smashing through his skull with a dull thud. Poole sees it happen. He watches as one of his men drops to the ground, unmoving, and something cold and vicious ignites in his chest. He wades forward, his butcher's tools swinging like sledgehammers. He grabs a dead rabbit by the collar and drives his cleaver into the man's temple so hard his body goes limp before he hits the ground. Another rabbit charges him with a knife, the blade flashing in the gaslight. Poole twists aside at the last second, grabbing the man's wrist. With a brutal twist he turns the hand and embeds the blade deep into the man's chest cavity. The rabbit screams, his knife clattering to the pavement, but Poole isn't finished. He drives his knee into the man's face, rendering him lifeless. The riot rages for hours. Men fight like animals, tearing at each other with fists, boots and blades. The police arrive, but they don't stop it. Some of them are nativists, others are Irish. They join the battle instead of breaking it up. By the time the chaos dies and the screams fade, over 30 men are dead and 120 more are wounded. Bodies litter the square, some still moving, others breathing their last in pools of their own blood. And in the centre of it all stands William Poole, smiling, surveying the message that has been sent out to all immigrants all over the city. You are not welcome. New York, February 24th, 1855. The air is thick with pipe smoke and the sour scent of whiskey. Inside a saloon on Broadway, William Poole is at the height of his power. He's the undisputed leader of the Bowery Boys, the face of New York's violent nativist movement. But power breeds enemies. The night starts like any other. Poole is drinking at Stanwix Hall, a saloon filled with gamblers, gangsters, and crooked politicians. He's laughing with his men, playing cards, throwing back whiskey like he owns the place. Then the door swings open. John Morrissey walks in. Behind him, Lou Baker and Jim Turner. 3 men with murder in their eyes. His biggest one? John Morrissey, an Irish bare-knuckle boxing champion, a man just as violent as Poole and just as feared. Morrissey hates Poole, hates everything he stands for, hates how he spits on the Irishmen, women and children, hates how he humiliates them in the street. Poole sees them, but he doesn't flinch. He's William Poole. He's fought his way out of worse than this. The men stare at each other across the room, the tension sharp as a knife's edge. Words are exchanged. The whiskey burns hot in their veins. Then someone stands. A chair scrapes against the floor. Lou Baker's pistol flashes, the atmosphere pierced with a gunshot. The bullet slams into Poole's chest, tearing through flesh and muscle. Poole stumbles backward, his breath catching, blood blooming across his waistcoat, but he doesn't fall. Another shot. Another bullet rips into his side. Poole staggers, clutching the bar, fingers slick with blood. The saloon erupts into chaos, chairs tipping, men diving for cover. But Poole, he's still standing, bleeding, gasping, but alive. Baker and Turner rush out, disappearing into the streets. Poole collapses to his knees, but even as he chokes on his own blood, his face twists into a snarl. He locks eyes with Morrissey. Morrissey smirks, fakes a tip of the hat, and backs out of the saloon calmly, his face fading slowly into the shadows of New York City. Poole doesn't die that night. He's carried home, laid in his bed, the room thick with cigar smoke, and the hushed whispers of only the most loyal of gang members. Doctors try to save him, but the bullets are deep, the wounds rotting inside him. He lingers for 2 weeks, the pain stretching on, his infected body turning against him. And then, on March 8th, 1855, William Poole, Bill the Butcher, the terror of the 5 Points, finally breathes his last. His final words, "Goodbye, boys. I die a true American." And with that, the Butcher is no more. His death didn't end the war. It only made him a martyr. His funeral was a spectacle, the kind New York had never seen before. Thousands packed the streets, a sea of black coats and stiff hats, marching in silence as Poole's coffin rolled through Manhattan. The Bowery Boys, his gang, walked beside it, faces hard, fists clenched, knowing that their leader had been murdered in cold blood. You would think killing a man in a saloon in front of dozens of witnesses would mean certain death for Lou Baker. But this was New York. And in New York, justice was a game. Baker was arrested and put on trial, but the case was botched from the start. The jury, many of them Irish, dragged out the verdict, and after 2 trials, the case ended in a mistrial. Baker walked free. The Bowery Boys never got their revenge, not the way they wanted. But his death hardened the nativist movement. It turned him into a symbol, a fallen warrior in the battle against Irish immigrants. The war against the Irish didn't die with him. It evolved. The 5 Points, once the battleground, kept on burning. The Irish, strengthened by numbers, fought back harder. More gangs rose, more blood spilled. By the 1860s, the Dead Rabbits had swelled in size, and their street wars against nativist gangs shook the city for decades. By the early 1900s, these street gangs evolved into something even bigger. They became the foundation of the New York Mafia. Many of the men who ruled the city in the 1920s and 30s, the gangsters who built the modern underworld, were children or grandchildren of the same Irish and Italian immigrants Poole tried to wipe out. Poole's war didn't stop immigration. It didn't stop the Irish. It only sharpened their resolve. And when men like Oney Madden, Johnny Torrio, and Al Capone came to power, they didn't forget the old battles of the 5 Points. Poole's fight had started as a street war, but in the end, the immigrants won.